The 117th Terran Legion should have died long ago, when the Terran High Command turned on them, branding them as traitors and exiling them beyond the charted edges of space. The universe wrote them off as ghosts, dead men drifting in the void. Their crime: refusing to slaughter helpless alien refugees at the order of a corrupt admiral who wanted a war. The Legion had upheld their oath to protect the innocent. For that, they were sentenced to oblivion. But oblivion had not taken them. For 23 years, they survived in the dark, scavenging from the wreckage of forgotten wars, raiding derelict ships, adapting alien technology to keep their aging fleet running. They became something more than soldiers, warriors without a nation, bound only by the unbreakable brotherhood of the betrayed. They had no home, no allies, and no future. Until now. Commander Voss, a voice crackled over the bridge speakers of the Ironclad, the Legion's flagship. You're going to want to hear this. Darius Voss stood at the center of the ship's war room, his battle-scarred armor dull under the glow of holo displays. A veteran of 100 campaigns, his presence carried the weight of the years he had stolen from death. His second-in-command, Captain Celine Harlow, sent the transmission to the main display. It was a distress call, a shaky, static-filled message, barely holding together. The words were broken but clear enough to freeze the room. This is Cygnus 5. Under attack. Unknown force. Request immediate. The signal cut into shrieks of interference, then silence. Harlow exhaled sharply. That was human. A Terran colony. Voss said nothing at first. He stared at the frozen image of burning cityscapes, the desperate voice of a dying world echoing in his ears. Cygnus 5. He remembered that name. An outpost colony, far from the core worlds, barely worth mentioning in the grand schemes of the High Command, which meant no reinforcements were coming. How long ago? He asked. 4 hours. Voss turned to his officers, old warriors who had fought beside him long before their exile. Terran response. Harlow hesitated. None. That single word was an indictment. High Command had abandoned them again, just as they had abandoned the Lost Legion all those years ago. The weight of history pressed on Voss like an iron chain. Across the bridge, Colonel Thorne, the Legion's chief strategist, leaned forward. Unknown force, immediate attack, no response from Terran fleets. Could be pirates. Could be worse. His cybernetic eye glowed dimly as he analyzed the signal. Either way, we both know what happens when a colony sends out a distress call into the void. No one comes. The silence that followed was thick. They had survived by staying in the shadows, avoiding direct confrontations. They had no reason to fight for a world that had already been deemed a lost cause. And yet, Voss's hands curled into fists. The Legion had lost everything. Their honor, their names, their place in history. But their oath, the vow they had sworn long before their exile, still burned in their blood. They were soldiers, and soldiers did not turn their backs on the helpless. Voss exhaled. Prepare the fleet. Harlow arched a brow. That's an act of war against the High Command. Then let them make war on ghosts. He turned to the holomap, watching the dying light of Cygnus 5 flicker on the display. For 23 years, the Lost Legion had waited. Now they had one last war to fight. And this time, they would not be forgotten. The Ironclad led the fleet through the abyss of uncharted space, its engines burning like a vengeful star. The Lost Legion did not move like a sanctioned military force. They had no safe lanes, no authorized jump gates. They carved their own path, bending scavenged alien technology to their will, warping through unstable corridors of the void that no sane fleet would dare traverse. They had always been outcasts. Now, they were hunters. Inside the war room, the holomap flickered with real-time data. The fleet, 19 ships strong, a ragged mix of Terran war relics and repurposed alien vessels, was closing in on Cygnus 5. The closer they got, the more data their long-range scanners picked up. and every piece of that data made the tension on the bridge grow thicker. Multiple energy signatures across the surface, Colonel Thorne reported, his cybernetic eye glowing as he dissected the readings. City centers devastated. Orbital defenses are dead. Something burned through them in a single sweep. No sign of an organized resistance. Celine Harlow stood beside Voss, her arms crossed. "It's not pirates," she muttered. Voss nodded. "It's a purge." Harlow's jaw tightened. "The same kind of purge we were ordered to carry out all those years ago." Voss didn't respond. He didn't need to. They both knew what this meant. A chime echoed through the bridge. The fleet had reached the outer edge of the Cygnus system. A final scan came through, sharpening the fuzzy reports into grim clarity. The holo display filled with the image of the planet's surface. Fires raged across the cities, their skeletal remains barely holding together. The once thriving colony was now a graveyard, the air thick with swirling plumes of smoke. But the destruction was secondary to what lurked in the ruins. The enemy was waiting. Hundreds of sleek, insectile warforms moved through the ruins with unnatural precision. Their forms were jagged and angular, metallic bodies shifting and adapting in eerie synchronization. They were not pirates. They were not mercenaries. They were not even human. "Selnar," Thorne growled, his mechanical fingers clenching into a fist. The bridge fell silent. For over 200 years, humanity had believed that Selnar were extinct. The machine race had been the nightmare of the last great war, a self-replicating horror that sought not conquest, but consumption. When the war had ended, the remnants of their species had vanished into the void, leaving behind nothing but shattered planets and haunted battlefields. And now, they were here. Voss exhaled slowly. Weapons hot, full battle deployment. Drop pods prepped for immediate insertion. A ripple of motion spread through the bridge. Officers barked orders. Ship crews raced to their battle stations. Across the fleet, old war machines stirred to life. Ancient rail cannons charging, missile silos unlocking. But even as the Legion prepared for battle, Harlow studied the enemy movement on the screen. Something felt wrong. "They're not advancing," she muttered. Voss turned to her. She pointed at the display. "We just entered orbit. Any normal hostile force would react. But they're just waiting." Thorne's face darkened. "They know we're here." The realization sank in like cold steel. The Selnar weren't mindless machines. They learned. They adapted. And if they were waiting... The entire fleet jolted. Warning sirens screamed. Multiple signatures, a deck officer shouted. "They're coming from beneath the surface." The planet erupted. Massive black structures burst from the ground, hurling debris into the sky. The Selnar had hidden their true numbers beneath the colony, and now they were launching themselves toward the Legion's fleet like a tidal wave of metal and death. "They set a trap," Harlow hissed. Voss's voice was steady, ice-cold. "Then we break it." The Lost Legion had not fought for 23 years just to die in the first battle. "All ships," Voss ordered. "Fire at will." The void ignited as the dead came roaring back to life. The void burned with fire and fury. The ironclad's main cannons roared, unleashing tungsten slugs the size of dropships. The first shot tore through a Selnar warform mid-flight, ripping its metallic body apart in a burst of shrapnel. The second blast turned another into molten slag. Across the battlefield, the rest of the Lost Legion's fleet followed suit. Railguns, missile barrages, and ion cannons lighting up the dark like the wrath of old gods. But the Selnar were not like any enemy humanity had fought before. For every machine torn apart, two more took its place. They swarmed through the chaos, twisting and adapting, reshaping their forms mid-flight. Some morphed into needle-thin darts, slipping through the flak fire to slam into Legion hulls. Others expanded into sprawling masses of segmented limbs, latching onto warships and tearing into the armor with cutting beams and piercing claws. Aboard the ironclad, Voss gripped the command rail as the ship lurched from the impact of an enemy strike. Sparks rained from overloaded consoles, crew shouting over the alarms. "Shields at 30%. Harlow called out, gripping the edge of her station. "Hull breaches on decks 7 and 8. Damaged teams en route." Thorne swore, "This isn't a battle. It's a feeding frenzy." Voss narrowed his eyes at the holo display. The Selenar weren't attacking like a conventional force. They were targeting specific points: energy reactors, oxygen filtration systems, crew compartments. They weren't just trying to destroy the ships. They were trying to consume them. "We need to take the fight to the surface," he growled. "Prepare drop pods. Full combat deployment." Harlow snapped her head toward him. "You want to go down there? That's exactly what they want us dead," he cut in. "But they're not expecting us to fight like cornered wolves." Harlow exhaled, then smirked. "You better be right about this." Moments later, the order rang out through the fleet. Across every ship, Legionnaires rushed to their drop pods, battle-hardened soldiers clad in a mix of old Terran armor and scavenged alien tech. They slammed their helmets into place, weapons primed. The final order came through. Drop. The pods ejected from the fleet like a hailstorm of steel and fire, plummeting toward the ruined surface of Cygnus 5. As they fell, the Selenar swarmed toward them, their forms twisting in midair to intercept. Legionnaires inside the pods gritted their teeth, gripping their rifles. The first pod was struck, torn apart before it hit the ground. Then another. But the rest broke through the firestorm, slamming into the shattered cities below. The battle for Cygnus 5 had begun. ####. Voss's pod hit the ground with a seismic crash, metal plating screeching as it skidded across the ruined streets. Explosive bolts fired, blasting the doors open. He stepped out into hell. The city was a graveyard. Towers once full of life now stood as blackened husks, smoke curling from their skeletal remains. The air was thick with the stench of burning metal, and something worse, the sickly, synthetic scent of the Selenar's presence. Around him, other pods slammed into the ground, their occupants emerging like avenging wraiths. Legionnaires formed up in squads, weapons sweeping the streets. Rail rifles hummed with energy, heavy exosuits powered up with a low thrum. Then the Selenar came. They moved like shadows of steel and death, skittering across walls, emerging from the rubble, dropping from broken buildings. Their bodies were constantly shifting, one moment insect-like, the next humanoid mockeries of their former victims. Their glowing eyes flickered with stolen intelligence. "Hold the line," Voss bellowed. The street erupted in gunfire. Legionnaires fought like demons, their rifles spitting tungsten rounds that punched through Selenar bodies. Grenades detonated, sending shrapnel into shifting limbs. A legionnaire in heavy armor waded into the fray, tearing through enemies with a plasma-edged combat blade. But the Selenar did not fall like normal enemies. The moment one was torn apart, its remains twitched, reshaped, and reassembled. Corpses became new war forms, the battlefield itself a shifting nightmare. Voss fired his rifle point-blank into a lunging machine, its skull-like face splitting apart as the round tore through it. He spun, his combat knife flashing as he severed another's arm. But even as it fell, the severed limb reformed into a writhing, metallic tendril, latching onto a fallen legionnaire and burrowing into his armor. "Burn them," Harlow shouted. "No bodies left behind." A soldier raised a flamethrower, unleashing a torrent of white-hot fire. The Selenar shrieked, their bodies tearing and breaking apart, unable to reform. That was the key. They couldn't let the enemy reconstitute. They had to erase them. The battle became even more brutal. Legionnaires adjusted their tactics, using fire and explosives to ensure no Selenar piece remained intact. The ground was soon littered with melting, twisted wreckage, the once indestructible machines reduced to nothing but slag. Voss pressed a finger to his comm. "Status report." A voice crackled through. pushing through the city, but there's something else down here. Not just machines. Voss's gut tightened. Clarify. Silence for a moment. Then, we found something, Commander. Voss exchanged a glance with Harlow, then spoke into the comm. Send me coordinates. Something deeper was at play here. The Selenar didn't just come to destroy. They came for something else, and Voss intended to find out what. Voss led his team through the smoke-choked streets, his mind racing as they pressed forward. The battle was far from over, but the silence of the comms disturbed him. The Selenar had been relentless, swarming like a tide, but they were not just machine warriors. There was something more. His boots crunched over broken concrete as they reached the coordinates. The others were close behind. Celine, Thorn, and a dozen of the Legion's finest. They moved in a tight formation, weapons raised, scanning for movement. There were still pockets of Selenar on the streets, but the strange feeling in the air was unmistakable. Something was pulling at the edge of Voss's senses. The lead soldier, Sergeant Alara, raised a hand, signaling for the team to stop. She crouched down by a piece of debris and carefully pried away a section of scorched metal. Beneath it, a hollowed-out section of the city's foundation led into a dark shaft. A thick stench, something unnatural, wafted up from it. Voss motioned for them to move in. They descended into the darkness, their footsteps echoing against the cold stone. The deeper they went, the thicker the air became, heavy with decay and the sharp tang of ozone. As they reached the bottom, the scene before them became clear. It was a cavern, vast and circular, its walls lined with what could only be described as pods, thousands of them. At first, they looked like simple storage chambers, the kind you might find in a forgotten industrial complex. But as Voss's eyes adjusted to the dim light, he realized they weren't just storage units. They were filled with bodies. The soldiers, or what was left of them, were suspended in the pods, humans, perhaps from the colony, but their forms were wrong. Their skin was pale and stretched tight against bone, eyes wide open but lifeless. They didn't look like corpses. They looked like preserved minds. Voss felt the weight of a terrible realization settle in his gut. These aren't just weapons, Harlow muttered. Her voice was low, barely above a whisper. They're collecting people. Thorn cursed. No, they're not collecting. They're processing them. Voss stepped forward, drawn to one of the pods. He knelt beside it, carefully inspecting the contents. The body within had been stripped of its humanity. There were no organs, no blood, only mechanical tendrils, wires, and a faint glow emanating from the hollowed-out skull. A tiny, pulsing light flickered at the center of the brain cavity. That's not possible, Voss said, his voice tight. They're turning people into parts, not just machines, but minds. Thorn approached another pod. They're not just harvesting bodies, he said, disgust in his voice. They're extracting minds. All of them. Voss straightened up, his heart pounding in his chest. The pieces were falling into place. The Selenar had been extinct, yes, but not all of them. They had never left. They had been waiting, evolving, learning how to take what they needed from humanity itself. They didn't want resources, weapons, or territory. They wanted minds. But why? The answer came in a flash, as vivid as a star going supernova in his mind. The Selenar had always been a collective consciousness, a single intelligence shared by all of their kind. But somewhere along the line, that unity had shattered. Their numbers dwindled, and they had turned to the most horrific solution imaginable: stealing the minds of others. They weren't just hunting humans. They were turning them into extensions of their consciousness, each mind they'd harvested adding to the collective intelligence of the Selenar. It wasn't just a takeover. It was assimilation, pure and simple. The more minds they harvested, the more powerful they became. We have to stop them, Voss said, his voice grim. If we don't, they'll turn every human in this colony into a cog in their machine. But how? Harlow asked. She looked over at the pods, her expression twisted with revulsion. How do we fight this? Voss's gaze hardened. He had led his men through impossible odds before. He wasn't about to fail them now. We burn it all, he said with a calm determination. Every pod, every piece of this machine. They'll never take another mind. We'll make sure of it. Thorne's lip curled. And how do you propose we do that without becoming part of their collection ourselves? Voss turned back to the team, his voice unwavering. We destroy it from the inside. We'll overload their processing systems, cut off the flow of minds. Whatever they're using to extract and store them, we'll burn it to the ground. Harlow looked at him, considering the plan. It's a suicide mission. Then we die fighting, Voss said. And we make sure they know who did it. The team nodded, the decision made. They didn't know if they could stop the XLR, or if they were walking into a trap designed for their destruction. But one thing was certain, the Lost Legion was not going to let this stand. Not now, not ever. They had lost everything once, but they would not let humanity be lost to the XLR. Not while they still drew breath. Voss stood tall, his hand tightening on his weapon. Let's finish this. The plan was set. They would infiltrate the heart of the Selenar's underground network, destroy the machines that processed human minds, and ensure that the alien race could never turn humanity into its puppets. The deeper they went, the more the oppressive air around them grew thick with dread. The walls of the cavern seemed to pulse, as if the very earth was alive with the energy of the Selenar's twisted experiments. They moved quickly, staying low and keeping to the shadows. Every step seemed to echo in the silence, their presence like a whisper against the roar of a distant storm. The deeper they descended, the more grotesque the sights became. There were more pods now, rows upon rows of them, each one a testament to the horror that Selenar had brought to Cygnus 5. The bodies inside twisted in grotesque forms, their faces frozen in terror or agony. Human, alien, and the occasional hybrid, each one suspended, their consciousness slowly drained into the collective hive mind of the Selenar. It was a nightmare that would make even the strongest minds buckle, but Voss and his team had no time for fear. They moved on, one foot in front of the other, driven by the singular purpose that had kept them alive for so long. Protect humanity. Never stop fighting. Finally, they reached the heart of the complex, an enormous chamber filled with mechanical hums and the sickening scent of ozone and decay. The central core of the Selenar's operation stood before them, a towering structure of metal and organic matter entwined together in a sickening display of technological cannibalism. At its core was a massive brain. No, a collective consciousness, a fusion of thousands of minds. It pulsated with an eerie, otherworldly light, its tendrils extending outward, connecting to the thousands of pods around the chamber. It was a living, breathing machine, and it was hungry. This is it, Voss whispered, eyes narrowed as he took in the sight. We're going to need more than explosives to bring this down, Thorne said, his voice flat with the realization of the task ahead. Voss turned to Harlow. We need to find the heart of their network, whatever's powering this monstrosity. Harlow nodded, her hand moving instinctively to the holomap at her side. There's a central power core, right beneath this chamber. We could overload it, force a chain reaction, and bring the whole place down. Voss's gaze flicked to the swirling mass of wires and tendrils connecting to the central brain. And if we don't, we'll become part of that thing. All of us. The decision was clear. They couldn't afford failure. Not now. Not when the fate of every human being depended on what they did next. They began moving, weaving through the labyrinth of machines and pods, avoiding detection as much as possible. The deeper they went, the more the air seemed to hum with an unnatural energy. A voice, distorted and fragmented, began to echo through their comms. It wasn't human, but it was unmistakably intelligent. You are too late. The voice crackled in their heads, each word an assault on their minds. It was alien, monstrous. We are the Selenar. You cannot stop us. We have already won. Voss's eyes narrowed. He had heard it before. Voices trying to break the human spirit. He had experienced it in the darkest moments of war. But this voice, this presence, was something far worse than anything he had ever encountered. "We'll see about that," he muttered under his breath. They reached the power core. It was a sprawling machine, an abomination of twisted wires, cables, and synthetic flesh. The pulsating energy emanated from it, feeding the entire complex. And within the heart of it all, surrounded by a web of machinery, was a central control hub. A control hub that linked the human minds in the pods to the Tselnar's collective consciousness. "Here," Harlow said, her voice grim. "This is it." She motioned to a console embedded into the control hub. It was sleek, foreign, alien, but the tech wasn't completely beyond them. The Legion had scavenged alien tech before. With a little ingenuity, they could turn it against the XLR. Voss moved to the console. "Thorn, cover me." Thorn nodded, taking up a defensive position. Harlow stood by, her eyes scanning the darkened room for any signs of movement. The tension was thick in the air. The entire complex felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for them to make a mistake. Voss's hands moved quickly over the alien console, bypassing security protocols, linking it to the central core. He could feel the hum of the Tselnar's mind, its presence growing stronger with every second, like an invisible hand pressing against his skull. It was trying to reach him, trying to overwhelm him. But Voss had endured worse. With a final, furious punch of commands, the console flared to life. Red lights blinked as the central power grid began to destabilize. The Tselnar shrieked through the comms, their collective minds screeching in frustration. "No." The voice crackled again, distorted, panicked. "You cannot." The power core began to overload. Sparks erupted from the console, and the walls began to tremble. "It's too late." "No," Voss said, a dark smile crossing his face. "It's just begun." The explosion that followed rocked the entire complex, the shockwave pulsing through the core, setting off a chain reaction that would rip the Tselnar's operation apart. But they weren't out of the woods yet. The floor beneath their feet buckled. The walls cracked. The ceiling above began to cave in. The Tselnar were far from done. And neither were the Legion. But they would see this through to the end. There was no turning back now. The explosion was a deafening roar that shook the very foundation of the underground complex. The power core detonated with the force of a small star, ripping through the heart of the Tselnar's operations. The shockwave sent Voss and his team sprawling, knocking them off their feet and slamming them into the cavernous walls. The ground buckled beneath them as debris rained down in a storm of jagged metal and burning rock. Voss gritted his teeth and pushed himself up, his head spinning from the blast. He could taste the bitter tang of smoke in the air, his vision blurred by the dust and debris that filled the cavern. Around him, the team scrambled to their feet, each of them battered but alive, at least for the moment. "Status report," Voss barked, his voice a hoarse command as he tried to focus on his surroundings. Harlow, her face smeared with dirt and blood, coughed once, then rose from the rubble. "We're still standing." "Barely." She checked her weapon, the faintest of smiles playing on her lips despite the chaos. But that explosion hit hard. Their systems are down, but it won't be long before they start adapting. Thorn staggered up, holding his head as he muttered curses. "A few more hits like that, and I'll be hearing that voice in my skull forever. I swear, it feels like they're still reaching." Voss nodded. "They are. But this is our chance. We need to finish what we started." He turned toward the ruined control center. The once thrumming heart of the Tselnar's operation was now little more than a smoking wreck. But even as the flames began to die down, the walls around them seemed to pulse with a life of their own, slow, deliberate, as if the very structure was trying to repair itself. "We need to move fast," Voss muttered, scanning the cavern. "The collapse won't stop them. Let's get to the surface. Now." The team fell in line, moving swiftly through the broken remains of the complex. The walls shook intermittently, the cavern creaking and groaning as it buckled under the weight of its destruction. But as they reached the cavern's exit, the ground shifted beneath them, sending shockwaves through the already damaged structure. "Get down," Thorn yelled. A massive chunk of the ceiling gave way, plunging toward the squad. Without hesitation, Voss tackled Harlow out of the way, the two of them rolling across the floor as the debris crashed down where they had just been standing. More rubble fell in waves, and the team ducked and covered as best as they could. But it was clear they wouldn't make it out without more trouble. Voss pushed himself up again, scanning the chamber. "We're trapped," Harlow gasped, pulling herself to her feet. The walls began to pulse more rapidly now, a rhythmic thrum that seemed to call to them, urging them forward, toward the next wave of destruction. But something was off. The Selnar's overwhelming presence hadn't died with the explosion. If anything, it had intensified. Voss glanced toward the far side of the cavern, where a new formation of Selenar machines was emerging from the walls. This time, however, they weren't the disjointed remnants of their former selves. These creatures were different. They were formed, coordinated. Their bodies were no longer twisted heaps of metal and organic matter. They were sleek, deadly, intelligent, and they were moving with a purpose. "It's not over," Voss said, his voice grim. "They're adapting." "We're outgunned," Thorn said, his hand tightening around his weapon. "Those things are too smart for us to fight head-on." Voss's mind raced. The team was exhausted, their supplies running low, and the odds were quickly turning against them. But there was no backing down now. "They'd got one big advantage," he said, his gaze focused. "The mind connection." "Meaning?" Harlow raised an eyebrow. "Their collective consciousness is linked. If we can disrupt that connection, the machines will lose coordination. They'll fall apart without their hive mind. The problem is, we need to find the source and destroy it." Thorn glanced at the advancing machines. "You mean, get to the brain?" "Exactly," Voss said, meeting Thorn's eyes. "We've come this far. We don't leave until we finish the job. Now, move." The team sprinted through the rubble, dodging falling debris and narrowly avoiding the Selnar's relentless pursuit. The creatures were fast, relentless, and seemingly indestructible, but they were still machines. They could be outsmarted, outmaneuvered, and, if they were lucky, destroyed. Voss led them deeper into the cavern, following the tremors and the low hum of the Selnar's energy. The walls seemed to pulse around them, the very structure of the complex shifting, as if the Selnar were rebuilding it in real time. They could hear the machines closing in behind them, the faint clicking of their metallic legs reverberating through the tunnel. The path ahead narrowed, and Voss gestured for the team to take cover behind a jagged outcrop. They huddled together, catching their breath. "We don't have much time," Harlow said, glancing over her shoulder. "They'll be on us any second now." Voss nodded, his eyes locked on the dark tunnel ahead. "We finish it here. We make sure they can never rebuild again." With one final push, they charged down the narrow passageway, the roar of the Selnar's machines growing louder, filling the cavern with the promise of an inevitable confrontation. The Lost Legion would face the greatest challenge of their lives, but they would face it head-on. There was no retreat. Not this time. Not while humanity's future hung in the balance. The narrow tunnel stretched ahead like a vein in the body of the Selnar complex, guiding them toward the heart of the nightmare. The air had become thick with energy, a pulsing, almost tactile sensation that seemed to press against their skin, urging them forward. The walls shimmered with unnatural light, flickering with the energy of the Selnar's collective consciousness. Voss led the way, his every step careful but deliberate. The team moved in formation, their weapons raised, ready for the final showdown. The echo of the Selnar's machines growing closer was an oppressive weight on their backs. They could feel the hum, the call. It was as if the very ground beneath their feet was alive with the mind of the Selnar, reaching out, probing for any weakness. The passageway began to widen, and they emerged into a massive chamber, the core of the Selnar's hive. At the center was a pulsing mass, a swirling vortex of organic matter and technology fused together in a grotesque harmony. It resembled a brain, but not any brain they'd ever seen. This was a living, sentient network, a hive mind in its purest form. The walls of the chamber were lined with countless tendrils, cables, and metallic appendages that reached toward the center, feeding the massive neural structure. Voss felt the weight of the room's presence pressing on his mind. It wasn't just the physical danger of the machines that they had to fight. It was this thing at the heart of it all. "Can you feel it?" Harlow whispered. "Yeah," Thorne replied, his voice tense. "Like it's trying to get inside my head." The Selnar weren't just fighting physically. They were trying to overwhelm their minds, to draw them into the collective. Voss could feel it, too, the pull, the pressure, as if the brain at the center of the chamber was calling to them, wanting them to join. "No time for distractions," Voss said, his voice low but firm. "We take it out now." They moved cautiously forward, keeping their distance from the mass at the center. Every instinct told them to strike, but they knew the core was surrounded by thousands of connections. One wrong move, and they would be swallowed whole. As they approached, the walls seemed to react. The tendrils and cables rippled, shifting like a living organism. Suddenly, the ground beneath them cracked, and the floor trembled. Voss barely had time to shout a warning before the first wave of Selnar machines appeared. These weren't the disjointed remnants they had fought before. These were sleek, deadly, perfectly coordinated. The machines charged, their metal limbs moving in perfect harmony, like a swarm of hunting predators. They moved with intelligence, with purpose. Voss snapped his rifle into place and fired. The rounds tore into the lead machines, but they didn't stop, they adapted. The armor deflected the shots, and the creatures continued to press forward. "Damn it," Thorne shouted, firing into the advancing line. Harlow grabbed a grenade from her belt, pulling the pin and tossing it into the midst of the Selnar swarm. The explosion sent a shockwave through the chamber, knocking back several of the machines, but it was only temporary. The Selnar kept coming, relentless as ever. "We need to get to the center," Voss shouted over the gunfire. "The mind is in there. Destroy it, and the machines fall apart." He didn't wait for a response. With a roar, he charged forward, diving beneath a slashing blade from one of the Selnar machines. He landed hard, rolling across the floor and coming up beside one of the central tendrils that connected the neural core to the walls. Without hesitation, he slashed at it with a vibroblade, severing the thick cable. The Selnar shrieked in rage, the pulse of their mind flickering and faltering for an instant. Voss grabbed a small device from his belt and activated it. A beacon. He tossed it toward the center of the chamber, where the core of that Selnar mind pulsed with angry energy. "Now," he yelled. The team rushed forward, firing at the machines blocking their path. Each shot was calculated, designed to disable rather than kill. They couldn't afford to waste ammo or time. They had to take down the central core, and they had to do it now. Harlow reached the beacon, activating it. The device whirred to life, sending a signal to the nearby power grid. There was a blinding flash of light, and for a brief moment, the entire chamber went still. The Selnar's mind recoiled, as if struck by a blow. Then, with a violent, chaotic surge, the core began to destabilize. The brain-like mass at the center of the chamber shrieked in agony, its tendrils flailing wildly as the connection to the machines fractured. Sparks flew from the walls as the entire complex seemed to buckle under the strain. The swarm of Selnar machines paused, their movements erratic, their coordination faltering. "This is it," Voss shouted. "Finish them." The team poured fire into the remaining machines, their shots becoming more frantic as the chamber trembled, and the Selnar's hive mind began to tear apart. Each shot was another blow to the Selnar, pushing them toward the final collapse. Voss turned toward the central core, his weapon raised. With a steady hand, he took aim at the heart of the pulsating mass. One shot. One chance. He fired. The shot slammed into the neural mass, and with a deafening crack, the Tselnar's hive mind shattered. A massive explosion rippled through the chamber, sending shockwaves through the entire complex. The walls buckled, and the machines, their minds no longer linked, collapsed into lifeless heaps. For the first time in what felt like forever, silence descended on the battlefield. The heart of the Tselnar's empire had been torn apart, and their machines lay shattered. But the cost had been high. The chamber was falling apart, the entire structure beginning to collapse into ruin. Voss looked over his team. They were all battered, bloodied, but alive. "Move out," he said, his voice grim. "We're not out yet." The Lost Legion had struck a blow against the Tselnar, but the war was far from over. Their victory would cost them. But humanity had one last chance. The final fight was about to begin. The ground shook once more, but this time it was different. There was no rumble of falling walls, no cracking of ancient stone as the Tselnar's empire came to a close. It was the pulse of victory, humanity's victory. Voss led his team through the final stretch of the collapsing complex, the distant sounds of destruction muffled by the adrenaline that surged through their veins. Each step was a testament to their survival, a proof that they had defied the odds, that the Legion had prevailed against a force that had once seemed invincible. Behind them, the cavern continued to crumble, the echoes of the final battle reverberating through the now-dead structure. The Tselnar were finished, their hive minds shattered, their machines lying in ruins. But the ground still trembled beneath their feet, the last remnants of the alien menace falling away like dust in the wind. Voss didn't look back. He couldn't afford to. The team was battered, bloodied, and exhausted, but they were still alive. That was all that mattered. "We're almost there," Harlow said, her voice strained but determined. "We keep moving until we're out of this damn tomb," Voss replied, pushing forward. Thorn's face was grim, his body bruised, and his movements slower than before, but his eyes still burned with the fire of a warrior who had survived a hell of their own making. He glanced over his shoulder, his weapon held tight in his hands as if it were still ready for battle. "Just a little longer," he muttered, though even he knew the danger had not passed. The passage narrowed as they reached the surface. The light at the end of the tunnel was a welcome sight, the faint gleam of the sky above shining through the jagged cracks in the walls. There was no telling what awaited them outside, but it didn't matter. They had survived the depths, and now they would face whatever the world had to offer. Finally, they emerged from the underground complex, their eyes squinting against the harsh light of a new day. The air was thick with the scent of the earth, fresh and cool against their war-worn faces. For a moment, there was silence, the team standing together, taking in the sight of the world they had saved. The world was still there. Humanity was still there. Voss stepped forward, his boots crunching against the gravel as he looked toward the horizon. The sky above was clear, a soft blue that stretched endlessly. The devastation of the past weeks had left its mark on the landscape, cratered fields, broken cities, the scars of war, but it was not the end. It was the beginning of something else. "We did it," Harlow said, her voice soft but filled with relief. Voss turned to face his team. "Yeah, we did." But even as the words left his lips, he knew that the fight was far from over. The Tselnar had been defeated, but their technology, their secrets, still lingered. There was too much at stake. Humanity's future had been secured for now, but it would always be fragile. Always. "We can't stop here," Voss said, his voice hardening as the weight of his responsibility settled back onto his shoulders. Thorn raised an eyebrow, his expression tired but thoughtful. "You mean, we keep fighting?" "No," Voss said, shaking his head slowly. "We rebuild. We learn. We make sure nothing like this ever happens again. We protect the future, not just for ourselves, but for everyone." The rest of the team nodded in agreement, the resolve in their eyes sharpening. The Lost Legion had been born in the fires of war, and though the battle had been won, they would carry the legacy of their struggle into the future. Rebuilding the world will take time, Harlow said. But we're alive, and that's a start. Voss smiled faintly, though the weight of their journey was far from over. We'll make it, together. The sun was rising higher in the sky now, casting a golden glow over the landscape as the team made their way toward a nearby settlement. The war was over, but there was much left to do. They had won their fight, but the work of rebuilding, of forging a new humanity from the ashes, had only just begun. As the Lost Legion walked toward their future, the echoes of their victory reverberated through the world. The Xelnar were no more. The battle had been long and hard, but in the end, humanity had prevailed. Against all odds, they had survived. They had fought for their future, and they had won. And as the dawn of a new era broke over the horizon, one thing was certain: humanity would rise again. Stronger, wiser, unyielding. The Lost Legion had made sure of that.